The following program is rated T for teen for the use of tools and materials that can be harmful to unsupervised usage. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello everyone, Mister Waugh here from Mister Waugh Media, and yes, that is my actual name. And today, a very special collaborative episode. Mister Waugh Media and Play-On-Tabletops bring you the War for Armageddon.
Okay, boys. Okay, I think we got it.
Now this was an amazing project to work on. I met the Play-On-Tabletop guys in the local 40k tournament circuit a couple years back, and ever since then, we've wanted to do a unique collaborative project. And what better way to do that than an iconic battle, the War for Armageddon between Gazgull Thraka and the defenders of Helsreach. Now for those that don't know, Play-On-Tabletop is one of the biggest YouTube channels out there when it comes to the 40k content especially, but they also delve into fantasy stuff, they've done Conquest, and other fantastic games. They put an incredible amount of production into each episode, and it was an absolute blast and honor to work with them. So we sat down and decided we're going to do an 8x4 table, including the iconic walls, including a breach that a Titan would be able to fall through. Now, the only downside to this was I had 3 weeks to get the whole project done, and that's dealing with my day job and halfway through getting very sick. But I persevered, and I think I got you guys a really amazing table to look at. Now, normally, if you're new here or if you're a veteran of this channel, you'll know that I break things down every step of the way of how I build things. Unfortunately, due to the time restraints, I didn't have that luxury. But I did take a lot of pictures along the way. Near the end there was a little bit more of a scramble, so I don't have as much footage. But I hope that you guys will still like the behind-the-scenes stuff. And with that, let's jump into this.
Well, unlike a lot of projects I do get to work on, this I didn't have the luxury of doing a mock-up or a demo beforehand, because let's face it, you're not usually given that luxury when working on an 8x4 table. So, I threw myself into the fire with only 3 weeks to get this finished. Now, the very first thing that I did was went down to Rona's and picked up a few sheets of styrofoam. These things come in 8 feet in length and 2 feet in width, which means if I chop them in half, I have 4 panels to work with, 3 of which you can see here on the screen. The 4th would be the interior of the city, which I'd work on at a later date. Once I had them all laid out, I began to sketch on there, following the notes that I came up with talking Nick in a conference call. We decided that the desert is going to be pretty void of any terrain overall, except for the big sweeping hills and a couple busted oil pipes here and there. That way the main focal point would be the Hive City walls and the legion of orcs slamming into it. After I submitted a couple of concept sketches for Nick and Talk for final approval, it was high time that I actually begin working on this project. The very first thing I did was take some black styrofoam sheets and laid them out so I had an idea of where the walls were going to lay. Once I had that more or less to my satisfaction, I began working on the walls themselves. Each segment was 10 inches in height and 10 inches in length, and since they are 1 inch in thickness means 2 together is a 2-inch thick wall, which should be plenty of space for most infantry to stand up there comfortably. Once I was satisfied with the thickness and the layout, I started working on the detail work. For this, I just used the width of my ruler to give me the different lines there, and then began etching in all the bricks. It's not overly complicated, and it just takes a bit of time, especially if you're doing multiple panels, but it goes by relatively quickly. I then used a thin strip of cereal box at the very top there, and started using little beads that I found at the dollar store, which I thought would make kind of cool rivets. The last part of the wall was the metallic rampart at the very top, which would protect the soldiers from incoming firepower, and was a pretty straightforward process overall. I just took some wavy cardboard and bent it backwards, as you can see here, and took a long strip of pink styrofoam to bolt it into place. For the flooring, I went with my go-to if I'm ever doing a metallic surface, which is, surprisingly, screen door. You just give that stuff a base coat of black and dry brush some silver on there, and it looks amazing for something that's really cheap and affordable. So I just cut out a strip that was 10 inches by 1.5 and gave it plenty of time to dry with some white glue. The final pieces were the columns that hold the cardboard arch in place there, and those are just the plastic tubes from a debit roll, and I just asked my coworkers to save me several of them. Once I was more or less satisfied with how the walls had turned out, it was time to start working on the towers. It was a pretty straightforward process. I just needed to make a cardboard box that was 3 inches by 3 inches and 12 inches in height. To make it look a little more interesting, I took some thin strips of cereal box and made some trim along all of the edges. I also took a slab of styrofoam and bolted it to the bottom there and cut it at an angle, just to make it look a little more like a brace for the tower. I don't really know the practicality, it just looked kind of cool. I also had some ideas for some vents later on, but that would come later down the road. I was more or less satisfied with all the pieces, so I started bolting them into place onto the styrofoam, and as you can see here, this was the final layout. You might notice that the final tower on the left-hand side is only half of a tower. I cut it specifically that way so it would still remain flush with the rest of the table. With the main defenses now finished, it was time to think of the other elements, such as the large breach in the walls and some trenches on the outside that the defenders would be using to try and stem the tide of this orc legion. For this, I began working on some trench networks that I've built in the past. If you're interested in some more details and a full build, I humbly suggest checking out my episode, Trenches, and of course, the Trench Network, which was an even bigger episode. We went even crazier. I think you guys will like it. Now at this point, this is what I was looking at overall for the project. I had the trenches outside finished, I had the towers in place, and 4 complete walls. But we need a breach, so I decided to put my fist through one of the walls and let it collapse. As you can see here, it is a breach big enough for tanks to roll through. I was pretty happy with this and did it a couple of times just to simulate where the bricks would fall, and added a bunch of extra details and, well, basically called it a day at that point. From here, it was time to start working on the hills outside the city walls, and something we decided early on was that they wouldn't be too dominating, only a couple inches in height, and a gradual incline that vehicles could move up and down with relative ease. I hacked out the crude shapes, and then I went to town here, as you can see, with some drywall mud to smooth all the surfaces out. Once that was completed, it was time to go to town with a whole bunch of white glue and a lot of sand. A lot of sand. Same here with the trenches and the blown out section of the wall. And from there, it was time to start painting everything. And let me tell you right off the bat, I went through a lot of paint for this project. It was crazy. The very first thing I did though was get some rattle cans from Army Painter, and they have a specific brand that when you use it on styrofoam, it doesn't actually eat them. My go-to one is called Dungeons and Subterranean, and I went through about 2 cans of this to cover everything, because even though this is covered in sand and glue, if there had been little gaps here and there, a traditional spray paint would have just dissolved the styrofoam, and all that work would have been for nothing. So I gave it plenty of time to dry, and then I started going to town on the main body with about 3 or 4 layers of different grays, darker, a medium, light, a light dry brushing of white on the surface there too, and that did the majority of the board. Like I said, I went through a lot of bulk paint. Once I was satisfied with that, I was doing little patches. First I started with some dark cinnamon colors, then dry brushed a little bit of burnt umber on there, and then a light sand color on top. And I did it in random patches, just to make it a little bit more visually appealing, so it wouldn't just be a mono gray color. For the pipes themselves, it was pretty straightforward. Just a couple quick pieces I picked up at the hardware store and dry brushed a little silver and brown over a black base coat, a little Agrax earth shade to tie it all together. As for the effect of it pooling out, that was done with a hot glue gun to make that oozing effect, and then some gloss black to really make it shine. You can actually check out a previous episode called Necromunda Accessories where I do this in a little bit more detail. From there, I was pretty happy with the overall board, and now it was time to start working on the city walls and the trenches. Now the trenches were pretty much exactly the same color palette since I wanted to match the board, the only exceptions being the wooden boards were a little bit more brown with cinnamons and darker colors, and the sandbags being a lighter tan color. Now as for the walls themselves, it's pretty much an identical color palette to the board, starting with the spray paint and then using several shades of gray, going from dark into a gradual lighter color. I then used an ample amount of washes on this thing. You can see it's dripping down from the pipes and the vents. Lots of brown was dusted on there to give it an old, decrepit look. The metallics were using just some gunmetal colors and a highlight of silver, and a generous amount of washing. Now the inside of the walls is the only place you'll actually see any different colors, and for this one it was the pipes and the base of the towers, which had several different shades of green, and the inside of where the blast has taken place and all the rubble is just spewed everywhere. That has a lot more blacks and browns and even some lighter colors in there, just to make it break apart the whole uniform look of the city walls. Now up until this point, I've shown you the first 3 panels, and I was pretty satisfied with how they looked and started working on the 4th one, which was the inside of the city walls. However, it was at this point that I got sick with the global cough that was going around, and it knocked me on my butt for a few days. And unfortunately, I didn't have the luxury of taking time off because I had a deadline to meet. I had 7 days left until they started filming. So I scrambled between trying to get enough sleep to recover my body and trying to pull off all the tricks that I could to make this thing pop out. You can see here I used the screen door technique. I used that on a lot of the flat surfaces, using different stains and rusting on them to try to make it look like an industrial city that's definitely past its prime. I also used some stuff to make a harbor, which I thought was a nice little touch. That's historically where the Ork submarines came bursting through and attacked the defenders from an angle that they did not expect the Orks to come from. So I was really happy with how the oil stains looked, all the murkiness and, if you can call it, water, and I was pretty happy with that effect. And overall, Play-On-Tabletop was really happy with how the final product came out, and they were very sympathetic for what I was going through. These guys are fantastic, and it was an absolute blast to work on them with this project. And here's a little teaser for you guys. This is not the last time you're going to be seeing my stuff on Play-On-Tabletop. We got a couple more collaborations in the future here. I won't say what, I don't want to spoil it, but keep your eyes peeled for more. On that note, I think I'm going to wrap up here, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. Well, that has been today's episode. I really hope you guys liked it and maybe found some useful information in there. If you did, make sure that you hit the like, the share, and subscribe button down below, and please pass this around to all your friends. We're really trying to build the channel from the ground up. If there's anything that you want me to build in an upcoming episode, let me know in the comments down below, and maybe we'll be able to build it for you in the future. On that note, I've been Mr. Waugh from Mr. Waugh Media, signing off.